People say that the most dangerous place a woman can stand is inside a burning building she refuses to believe is on fire. I believed in my marriage the way I believed in gravity, not because I had examined it carefully, but because I had never once imagined the floor giving way beneath me. I was 32 years old, newly pregnant with twins, and deeply convinced that love was enough to hold any structure together. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything. But I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened. Being wrong nearly cost me everything, and being right ultimately gave me a life I never would have found any other way. My name is Rachel. I am a licensed pharmacist. I spent 6 years in school learning how to read the invisible language written inside the human body. What substances do to cells, what compounds do to systems, what a single miscalculation can cost a person who trusts you with their health. I say this not to impress anyone, but because it matters to the story. It matters enormously, in fact. My mother-in-law discovered too late that marrying her son to a pharmacist was the single worst strategic decision she ever made. I met my husband at a charity gala his family hosted every September. He was warm and self-deprecating and nothing like the man I eventually realized he had been trained to be when his mother was not in the room. We dated for 2 years. He proposed on a Tuesday morning in our kitchen while I was still in my pajamas, and I cried so hard I knocked the coffee off the counter. I said yes before he even finished asking. We got married the following spring in a ceremony that was beautiful on the surface and deeply controlled underneath. My mother-in-law chose the venue, the menu, the flowers, the seating chart, and the song that played when I walked down the aisle. I smiled through all of it because I thought that was what a good daughter-in-law did. I thought I was being gracious. I was actually being groomed. My mother-in-law ran the family's commercial real estate portfolio, a collection of properties in 3 states worth approximately $40 million, built over 2 generations and held inside a family trust that my husband stood to inherit a controlling share of when he turned 35. He was 33 when we married. The math is not complicated. His mother had exactly 2 years remaining to control the narrative of his life before that trust transferred any real decision-making power to him, and she intended to use every single day of those 2 years. I did not understand any of this in the beginning. I understood only that she did not like me, and I spent the first year of our marriage trying to change that by being more helpful, more present, more careful, more accommodating. I cooked dinners she criticized. I attended her charity committees and listened to her stories about my husband's ex-girlfriends, all of whom were conveniently better educated, better connected, better suited for the life she had imagined for her son. I absorbed the comments and smiled and drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel and told myself she just needed more time. Then I got pregnant. I found out on a Thursday morning in late October. 2 pink lines, clear and unmistakable. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time, holding that test, feeling something so large move through me that I did not have a word for it. My husband held me and wept and said this was the best day of his life. We went to the doctor the following week and discovered it was twins, 2 heartbeats, small and fast and absolutely real on the ultrasound screen. We were stunned and terrified and overwhelmed with joy. We agreed to keep it quiet for a few weeks and then tell family together. What I did not know, and would not know for several more months, was that my mother-in-law had already hired an attorney 2 weeks before we discovered the pregnancy. She had found a clause in the original trust documents buried in language written 40 years ago by a grandfather who could not have predicted this situation that potentially allowed the trustee to contest an heir's share of distributions in cases of what the document called moral or financial misconduct. She had spent the better part of a year looking for a way to use that clause. And when she learned, through a phone call my husband made to his sister before we had told anyone officially, that I was carrying twins who would inherit alongside him, she decided she had run out of time. I noticed the change immediately. She became solicitous in a way she had never been before, calling more frequently, inviting us to Sunday dinners, dropping off food at our house with explanations about wanting to support the pregnancy. My husband was delighted. He told me this was exactly what he had hoped for, that a grandchild would finally soften her, that family would ultimately win. I smiled and said I hoped he was right. I also drove to the hardware store the following afternoon and purchased 2 small wireless recording devices because I had spent a year watching this woman, And nothing in her behavioral history suggested that warmth was a gear she knew how to shift into voluntarily. I placed one device in our home office where she often sat when she visited. I placed the second in my own purse, active whenever I was in her presence. I told no one. I told my husband least of all, because I already understood that my husband loved me genuinely, but was constitutionally incapable of believing that the woman who raised him could be operating with deliberate malice. He needed evidence he could hold in his hands. I was determined to eventually give it to him. The first Sunday dinner after we announced the pregnancy to the family was pleasant enough on the surface. My mother-in-law toasted us, kissed my cheek, asked about my symptoms with what looked like genuine concern. My sister-in-law, who had always been warmer to me than her mother, squeezed my hand under the table and whispered that she was so happy for us. I ate carefully and watched and listened and came home with a recording of my mother-in-law on a phone call I was not supposed to hear, taken in the kitchen while I was in the adjacent hallway, in which she told someone I later determined it was the attorney that she needed the paperwork ready before the babies were born, because after that it would be much harder to make the case. I sat in my car in our driveway that night and listened to that recording 4 times. Then I emailed it to myself with a time-stamped subject line, uploaded it to a cloud drive I had created under a separate email account, and texted the link to my mother who lives in Portland and who had never liked my mother-in-law from the moment they met at the engagement dinner. What followed was 3 months of the most careful and frightening documentation I have ever performed. I am a pharmacist. Careful documentation is the literal foundation of my profession. I knew how to be methodical. I knew how to record observations without emotional contamination. I wrote notes after every interaction, date, time, what was said, who was present, what I observed. I photographed documents when I had the opportunity. I recorded every phone call conducted in my presence. I built a file that grew from a single email to 47 pages and 12 audio recordings before my mother-in-law made her move. She made it on a Sunday in February. We had been invited for dinner, which I now understood was her preferred arena, a setting she controlled completely. About an hour after we arrived, while my husband and his father were in the garage, my mother-in-law asked me to help her carry platters from the kitchen. We were alone. She set down the dish she was carrying and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as clinical, not angry, not cruel, just measured and very cold. She said that she had something she needed to discuss with me privately before dinner, and that she hoped I would be reasonable about it. She told me she knew I had accessed the family trust documents that were stored in her home office filing cabinet documents that were private financial and legal records. She said a paralegal who worked with the family attorney had noticed that certain sections had been photographed based on metadata from a device connected to her home Wi-Fi network. She said she had not yet brought this to my husband's attention because she wanted to give me the opportunity to do the right thing first. She said the right thing would be to sign a postnuptial agreement that her attorney had prepared, which would waive my right to make any claims against trust assets in the event that our marriage ended, and which would establish certain conditions around the inheritance rights of any children born during the marriage. She said all of this in a completely level voice while holding a serving dish with both hands, as though she were discussing a grocery order. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. I felt the floor of my chest drop out. I felt my heartbeat go strange and fast and wrong. I was 7 months pregnant with twins and standing in my mother-in-law's kitchen being offered a quiet ultimatum that would have stripped my children of the inheritance their father intended them to have. The part of me that had spent a year trying to be gracious wanted desperately to find a way to interpret this charitably, to convince myself I had misunderstood. I took a breath. I picked up the other platter. I said, very calmly, that I appreciated her bringing this to me directly, and that I would need to discuss it with my husband and our own attorney before signing anything. She smiled thinly and said, of course, she understood completely, and that she hoped I would also think carefully about what kind of environment I wanted to raise my children in, and whether it was wise to create conflict in a family that could offer those children so much. I carried the platter to the dining room table. I sat through dinner. I ate and conversed and helped clear the dishes. I drove home. I put my husband to bed. I went to my home office, opened my laptop, and forwarded every recording, every photograph, every note in my file to the email account of a family law attorney I had quietly consulted 3 weeks earlier on the advice of a pharmacist colleague who had gone through her own difficult divorce. I attached a message explaining what had happened that evening and asking for an urgent appointment. Then I opened a second email and sent the same file to a forensic accountant who had been referred to me by that same attorney because in the course of 3 months of careful documentation, I had found something that had nothing to do with the postnuptial agreement or the trust clause or anything my mother-in-law had intended me to find. I had found, in photographed documents she had left briefly unattended on her office desk during one of our visits, evidence that she had been misrepresenting property valuations in the family trust's quarterly reports. Not by accident, not by rounding error, by hundreds of thousands of dollars, consistently, over at least 4 years, in a pattern that only makes sense if you understand that the trust had a provision paying a management fee to whoever served as trustee, and that fee was calculated as a percentage of total asset value. She had been inflating valuations. She had been paying herself more than she was entitled to. She had been doing it for years while my husband and his father sat at Sunday dinner completely unaware. My attorney met with me 3 days later. The forensic accountant began his review the following week. I said nothing to my husband. I know how that sounds. I need you to understand that I had tried, in smaller ways, many times before a comment here, a concern there, and every single time, I had watched him fold like a piece of paper under the weight of his loyalty to her. He needed the evidence complete before I showed it to him, because I could not afford for him to warn her. I was 32 weeks pregnant with twins. I did not have the luxury of another failed attempt. The postnuptial agreement arrived at our house by courier on a Tuesday addressed to me, not my husband. My mother-in-law had apparently decided that my request to consult our attorney was acceptable, but had set her own timeline. I handed the envelope directly to my attorney unopened. My husband found out everything on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks later, 9 days before our due date. I had asked him to come home early. I had made dinner. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, and I showed him the recordings, the photographs, the forensic accountant's preliminary report, the postnuptial agreement that had arrived addressed to his pregnant wife without his knowledge, and the transcript of the conversation in his mother's kitchen in February. I set it all in front of him in order, the way I would counsel a patient through a difficult diagnosis. Here is what the data shows. Here is what it means. Here is what we need to decide. He did not say anything for a very long time. He is not a man who processes things quickly. And what he was processing was the complete structural collapse of a 47-year belief system. I watched it happen on his face, and I felt something I did not expect to feel, which was grief. Not for myself, but for him. He had loved his mother without reservation, which is a genuine and beautiful thing to have done, and it had been used against him his entire life. He finally said, very quietly, that he needed to make a phone call. He went into the bedroom and closed the door. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. 20 minutes later, he came back out and sat down across from me again and asked what I needed him to do. I told him. He did it. The forensic accountant's full report was filed with the family attorney and simultaneously delivered to the trustees of the estate, which included my husband's father and a bank-appointed independent trustee who had been largely ceremonial until that moment. The independent trustee, it turned out, was not the kind of person who took financial misrepresentation lightly. He contacted the estate's attorneys within 48 hours. Those attorneys contacted the IRS, because what my mother-in-law had been doing was not only a violation of her fiduciary duty to the trust, but also created tax reporting discrepancies that flagged immediately once someone with the right credentials looked at 4 years of statements side by side. My daughters were born on a Wednesday morning, healthy and furious and perfect. My husband held one in each arm in the delivery room and cried with an openness I had never seen in him before, a kind of crying that only happens when someone has recently had the most important thing in their life put back into focus after a long period of dangerous blur. My mother-in-law was not notified that I had gone into labor. She found out 2 days later when my husband called her not to share the news, but to tell her that he would not be attending Sunday dinner anymore, and that he required no further contact from her attorney. The civil proceedings began 4 months after the girls were born. The IRS investigation ran parallel and independently. which is the way those things tend to go once they begin, like a fire that jumps the fire break and burns on its own schedule. My mother-in-law hired 3 separate attorneys over the course of those proceedings. She attempted twice to settle. Both times, the independent trustee declined on behalf of the estate. The final accounting, when it was complete, showed that she had taken just under $900,000 more than she was entitled to over 4 years of inflated valuations. The IRS determined that the trust had filed incorrect returns in 3 of those 4 years. The penalties and interest were significant. The federal charges were significantly more so. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of tax evasion in a courtroom I did not attend, because I was at home putting my daughters down for their afternoon nap. My husband went. He sat in the back row. He told me afterward that she had looked at him once, from the defense table, and that he had held her gaze without looking away until she turned back to her attorney. He did not say this with satisfaction. He said it with the particular flatness of a person who has finally, after great effort, put down something they had been carrying too long. She was sentenced to 31 months in a federal correctional facility and ordered to make full restitution to the trust. She was removed as trustee. The management fee arrangement was dissolved. The trust, with my husband now holding a controlling share following his 35th birthday earlier that year, was restructured by an independent management firm that had no personal relationship with anyone in the family. My sister-in-law called me the night after the sentencing. She was not complicit in what her mother had done. The investigation confirmed that, and the previous year had cost her enormously in ways I think only she fully understands. She cried on the phone for a while and then apologized for crying, and I told her there was absolutely nothing to apologize for. She asked how the girls were. I told her they had learned to sit up by themselves that week and were extremely pleased with themselves about it. She laughed. It was the first real laugh I had heard from her in over a year. I want to be precise about something, because I think it matters. I did not do what I did to punish my mother-in-law. Punishment was not the goal, and it was not the outcome I planned for. What I planned for was safety. My children's financial safety, my family's legal safety, and the specific safety that comes from knowing that a person who has demonstrated the willingness to manipulate everyone around them no longer has the structural access to continue doing it. I audited the situation. I found the discrepancies. I submitted the report. What the authorities did with that report was their work, not mine. People sometimes ask me whether I regret waiting, whether I should have confronted her earlier, told my husband sooner, moved faster. I understand why they ask. But here is what I know about timing. A case built on emotion falls apart under pressure. A case built on documentation does not. I was not going to bring my husband a feeling. I was going to bring him 47 pages and 12 audio recordings and a forensic accountant's preliminary report and a post-nuptial agreement addressed to his pregnant wife without his knowledge. And I was going to let him reach his own conclusion, because it had to be his conclusion to stick. My husband is not the same man he was 2 years ago. He is quieter in some ways and louder in others. He challenges things now at work, with friends, in conversations where the old version of him would have nodded along to keep the peace. He is a more present father than I think he would have been otherwise, because I believe that watching his mother's choices collapse into their full consequences taught him something urgent about what it means to actually stand in the room with the people you love and refuse to look away. He will never be a perfect partner. Nobody is. But he is trying in a way that is visible and genuine and occasionally so earnest that it makes me want to laugh and hold his face in both hands simultaneously. My daughters are 14 months old now. They do not have words yet, but they have opinions. Strong ones, communicated primarily through pointing and a specific high-pitched sound that means they have identified something they intend to have. They are funny and stubborn and deeply certain about what they want. And every time I watch them sitting on the living room floor conducting their own extremely serious investigations into the physics of stacking blocks, I feel something that is very close to what I felt on the bathroom floor holding that pregnancy test, something too large for a single word, something I will probably spend the rest of my life finding new language to describe. My mother-in-law's crimes did not destroy our family, they clarified it. They burned away every structure that was load-bearing, only in the sense that we had all agreed not to look too closely at what it was actually made of. What we have built since is smaller in some ways and more solid in every way that matters. My father-in-law is still in our lives, quietly devastated, doing the patient, difficult work of figuring out how to love his grandchildren when looking at them means confronting everything he chose not to see. My sister-in-law comes for dinner on occasional Sundays. The girls adore her. The postnuptial agreement sits in a folder in my home office filing cabinet, unsigned. I keep it not out of bitterness, but because I believe in keeping accurate records of the moments that change the direction of your life. It is a data point. It represents a calculation someone made about what I was worth and what I could be pressured into and how far loyalty to her own interests could be stretched before it snapped. She was wrong about all three. That does not make me smarter or braver or better than her. It makes me someone who spent 6 years learning to read invisible languages, and who understood even in her kitchen holding a serving dish that the most important thing was to keep accurate records. If you are standing inside what feels like a solid structure that something in you suspects is burning, I want to tell you something I had to learn the hard way. The smoke is not imaginary. The warmth you feel when you stand too close to the walls is not ambiance. The most loving thing you can do for the people who depend on you is to see the building clearly, document what you find, and make decisions based on evidence rather than on the story you were told about what the building was supposed to be. There is nothing noble about remaining in a structure that is designed to consume you. There is nothing disloyal about surviving. I have learned to let the things that are broken stay broken, and to spend my energy on the things worth building. My daughters are sitting on the floor between me and the window. The afternoon light is coming in at a low angle, catching the dust motes above their heads. And one of them has just discovered that if she puts a block on top of her sister's head, her sister will allow it precisely once before expressing a firm and loud opinion on the matter. They are both laughing now. The one with the block on her head is so delighted by her own outrage that she cannot quite sustain it. This is what I was protecting. Not trust fund distributions or property valuations or legal precedent. This room, this light, these two people, and the one sitting beside me on the couch who has finally, after a long and costly education, learned how to simply be present in it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it finds you wherever you need it most. If you have ever had to protect yourself or your family from someone who believed your silence was guaranteed, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me what it cost you to speak up, and what it cost you more not to. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe to Restoration Stories for more of these, because the best proof that something was worth fighting for is the life you build on the other side of it.